Laurie Garrett, award-winning journalist at Newsday, has the honor of being the only writer to receive all three of the big P's of journalism: the Peabody, the Polk, which she has received twice, and the Pulitzer. Garrett has been on the science writing staff of Newsday since 1988, where her work has garnered numerous awards. Garrett received doctorates in humane letters, honoris causa from Wesleyan Illinois University and the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. She was a visiting fellow in the Harvard School of Public Health during the 1992-93 academic year. She is the author of numerous articles and including a number of books, one of which is our book of the semester, which we hope you, if you have not purchased and read, you will have the opportunity to do so before final exams. Her book, Betrayal of Trust, The Crisis of Global Health, is the book of the semester, and her topic today is Bioterrorism and the Public Health System, Survival in the Global Village. Please join with me in welcoming to BYU and this semester, Laurie Garrett.
Thank you very much. I think I'll take it down just a tad here. Isn't that cool? Thank you for inviting me here and for some of you for perusing my book. I know they're large. I write large books. But hopefully not too burdensome to read. And actually the added bonus is if you get both of them, they're the same size, so they work as good matched bookends, you know, door stops. Well, we have a number of topics to try and cover in a fairly short period of time here, so I'm just going to push right ahead and talk to you about a fundamental set of changes in perspective that have occurred in Washington and in a number of other major centers of political thought and so on. Gentlemen, you might want to come down so you can enjoy the slides. A number of major political centers throughout the world that have brought people to think about global health concerns who hadn't been interested in thinking about them before. You're looking at pictures taken on September 11th, 2001 from the space shuttle. And in fact, I happen to live right here under the densest part of the plume. Right from the very beginning, this actually was an interesting scientific and health occurrence beyond being a terrible tragedy and a horrible example of terrorism in the world. Two molecules were emitted in this plume that have never been seen in the human, in Earth's air before. We don't know what they'll do to us. We do know that in laboratory studies, both are carcinogens, but beyond that, who knows? The other interesting thing about this plume was that the average pH of the plume was about 12. Now, any of you that have had a rudimentary chemistry class know that that's highly alkaline. And most natural disasters produce acidic plumes, such as volcanoes. We actually don't have a clearance mechanism in our lungs for clearing alkali salts from the lungs. So that, too, is a previously unseen, unprecedented biological event for which we have no capacity to predict outcome. And that's an interesting thought, an unexpected event for which we have no capacity to predict outcome. That would be 9/11 itself. That would be the whole new world that we live in. And the events from 9/11 only point towards a whole host of unpredictable new outcomes. Very shortly after 9/11, we had the first anthrax event, October 3rd, 2001. Robert K. Stevens came down with anthrax poisoning, dying the following day in West Palm Beach, Florida. And actually, New York was one of the only cities in the country, and indeed in the whole world, that had been preparing itself for biological hazards because we had been attacked by Al-Qaeda in 1993. And so New York City had been in a higher state of readiness. We'd been having these drills throughout the 1990s in which we pretended various sorts of things had happened, whether it was anthrax, whether it was a radiological bomb, whether it was a nerve gas in the subways. And though we were having the drills, I think most political leadership, most of the police, and indeed most of the hospital people thought they were just kind of a waste of time. You know, it couldn't really be this bad. Something this horrible couldn't really happen. Well, after the anthrax mailings to Capitol Hill, many of the politicians who had always insisted that those of us who'd been writing about this and warning about this for some time were a bunch of Chicken Littles screaming that the sky was falling, were suddenly duly impressed with the probability and possibility of a bioterrorist assault. And that's when most of them for the first time heard about Bioprepperat. Bioprepperat was a Soviet biological weapons program that involved 60 to 70,000 scientists and technicians working in more than 60 laboratories and test sites across the former Soviet Union. They had been manipulating hundreds of different organisms to try and make them deadlier, more transmissible, capable of withstanding various weapons conditions. In this particular facility, which I visited outside of Novosibirsk, Siberia, called Vector, they'd specifically been working on manipulating viruses. Everything from Ebola and influenza to smallpox. And in this facility, they had created 122 new strains of smallpox, including, they said, a strain that could be launched on an intercontinental ballistic missile and withstand the pressure of missile launch delivery. They'd even come up with an interesting design that involved these little vials with mini parachutes on them, and the missile would launch from somewhere in Siberia, end up over the west coast of the United States, and at a certain altitude would explode, and these little parachute devices would drift down and then secondarily explode right at human nose height. A really insidious set of devices and thoughts. Well, the problem is with Bioprepperat, they didn't shut it down until 1993, 2 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. And only when Margaret Thatcher, whose intelligence services found out about it first, well before our CIA did, only when she insisted personally to Boris Yeltsin that they had to shut the program down. Yeltsin claimed no knowledge of the existence of Bioprepperat, and indeed it was veiled in secrecy and answered directly to the Politburo. Well, the problem is that we don't really know what happened to all those 60,000 scientists. We don't really know what happened to all the inventory of samples of insidious organisms they had created. And there continued to be rumors in the intelligence community, though we have to be very careful. We know how false many of the rumors in the intelligence community have turned out to be over the last few years. But there continue to be rumors of sightings of certain specific former Soviet scientists in places like North Korea, Iran, and so on, and the possibility that they've taken their knowledge, if not their actual samples, to so-called rogue states. Well, whether or not this is accurate, it has spawned a whole new level of interest on Capitol Hill. Concern that a disease we had eradicated and against which none of you young people have ever been vaccinated and therefore have no immunity might return, might be deliberately released. A truly horrible thought. The last time we faced a smallpox epidemic or the possibility of it in the United States was 1947, long time ago, when a tourist who had been in Mexico and unknowingly acquired smallpox came to New York City and visited every single tourist spot from one end to the other of the city before dying of smallpox. In 6 weeks' time, the city inoculated 6.5 million people. New Yorkers actually obediently stood in lines, contrary to the typical image of a New Yorker. And everybody was corralled in, from the PTAs to the Boy Scouts to the Girl Scouts. Everybody participated and brought in people for inoculation. This is probably not a feat that we could repeat in any city, any large city in America today. We just don't have the public health infrastructure that we once had. We've allowed it to be eroded and cut and cut and cut in one round of budget cuts after another for decades on end. And at the local level, public health is tottering along on weak legs in most communities across the United States. Well, Congress hadn't really even uttered the phrase public health infrastructure in so long that most of them didn't even know what it meant. And there are still many politicians that think that public health means free medicine for poor people. They don't understand what public health is, so they don't know what they need to throw the money at. But one thing they do know is they're scared of bioterrorism, and they're afraid that somebody, whether it's a foreign force like Al-Qaeda or one of our local wackos, like the folks that were publishing these books and posting things on the internet, teaching you how to make botulism and how to poison your neighbors, might wage some kind of an attack. And I always like to remind people, because everybody seems to have forgotten, that Oklahoma City was not bombed by Al-Qaeda. Those were homegrown nuts. We've got plenty of them. It used to be, before 2001, that you could go to Soldier of Fortune magazine or a host of other sort of paramilitary magazines and find advertisements that would lead you to these books. I have a whole little library of them. They're all full of things like, the one recommendation in this book in particular that obviously whoever carried out the anthrax attacks didn't read was a whole section on how to mail anthrax spores to your enemy without poisoning the postal workers. And it involves spraying silicone inside the envelopes before putting the spores in. It's too bad our assailant hadn't read that. At any rate, the point is we have our own homegrown worries, and all of them, whether homegrown or foreign assault, would, our best defense is going to be our public health infrastructure. Well, here we are now, 3 years down the road, and billions of dollars down the road in terms of creating Office of Homeland Security and trying to create a better sense of preparedness. And Columbia University recently did a survey, a national survey, to determine how well it was working, at least in terms of public opinion. Do you have faith that the healthcare system can handle a terrorist attack? This year, 39% said yes, and that's down from more than half saying yes a year ago, or 2 years ago. Are you personally familiar with what you're supposed to do if there's an attack? And more than 3/4 said they haven't got a clue. We clearly have a long ways to go. Now, why? We've spent so much darn money. Every time you turn around, Congress is passing more money, more billions, to go into a starved public health system. There are several reasons why all this money hasn't managed to make the difference. First of all, it was not apportioned according to need. Congress voted that every state should get the same amount of money. So, on a per capita basis, Wyoming, the home of our vice president, gets $35.31 per person for bioterrorism preparedness, while New York, the only place to have been attacked by Al-Qaeda twice, gets only $5 per capita. If you look down the list, I mean, you're hard-pressed to think of prime targets for terrorism in Vermont or Alaska, but you can certainly think of them for New Jersey, New York, and California, and yet they have the lowest per capita spending rates from the federal government. So the first problem was how Congress, being politicians after all, decided the money should be allotted. The second is what the money went to. Surveys just finished in New York area show that hospitals feel woefully underprepared. There's only 4 things you really need to do for the hospitals. And now those 4 things are: 1, do you have surge capacity? Can you suddenly go from having 100 beds filled with intensive care patients to 1,000? Do you have the beds? Do you have the personnel? Do you have the equipment? Second, do you have decontamination facilities? If you think that what's out there is something that can be carried from one person to another on their clothing or their skin or what have you, do you have facilities outside of the hospital that can instantly be set up where they can be showered down so that they don't bring the contaminants into the facility, into the hospital? Do you have burn beds, a very specific type of care involved in treating people who've been seriously burned? If you had a radiological attack, you'd need millions of burn beds in a city the size of New York. And do you have the isolation capacity? Do you have rooms where somebody who has a highly contagious disease, such as smallpox, can be placed and treated safely without having their microbes spread through the ventilation system in your entire hospital and infect everybody in the facility? Well, it turns out those are the 4 things you want, and it turns out those are the 4 things which, as of 2 months ago, all the hospitals in the greater New York area said they don't have. And indeed, the surge capacity issue is really a deal breaker on the preparedness question, because what we've been doing with managed care and with trying to change the economics of healthcare in this country is eliminating surplus beds. Eliminating them. If anything, now we've got queues of people trying to get a bed in the hospital, and often the delays in the emergency room are all about nurses and doctors in the ER scrambling to find a bed to check you into somewhere in the facility. So what will we do in the case of surge capacity? Set up cots in the local high school? we're really in a difficult situation here, and we have one set of economic principles running right up against another set. Furthermore, all of this is coming on top of a system that has been hacked and hewed at for years. Years and years and years. We've eliminated our mosquito abatement programs. We've cut back on the numbers of people who inspect your water supply. We've reduced how many people inspect restaurants and how many people make sure that your children are properly vaccinated, and we could go on and on and on down the list. And in fact, in this very period when we've tried to build up the public health infrastructure for bioterrorism, we've actually seen the number of full-time equivalent personnel decrease across the board in the country. So how have people dealt with this then? If you were running, a county in Utah and you were in charge of all health in Utah and you got, say, $10 million over 4 years from the federal government to beef up bioterrorism preparedness, how could it be that you were losing personnel in the same time period? Easy. Number one, at least 47 of our states are currently on deficit spending. They have no money. So many governors said, oh goody, a federal line item coming in. We can cut more of our state expenditure and offset it with the federal money, even though the federal money is earmarked specifically for things like preparing for smallpox. Secondly, you didn't want to hire people because you don't believe, if you're in public health having suffered cuts for so long, you don't believe that the money will really be there the next year to keep them on salary. So what have you done? You've shifted people from other programs and said, for the time being, until the feds aren't interested in this anymore, you're going to work on anthrax and tularemia and botulism, and instead you're going to leave the programs you were in. So we've seen a huge reduction in support for tobacco and smoking campaigns, maternal child health, substance abuse, mental health, violence prevention, teen pregnancy, HIV, and tuberculosis all across the country. We also have, ironically, seen a reduction in precisely the skill set we would most need in the case of either a naturally occurring epidemic or a deliberately created one, and that is epidemiologists. Now, epidemiologists are your disease detectives. They're the folks who go in and figure out what has been released or what has surfaced naturally, what is the nature of the organism, who's getting it, how are they getting it, who's spreading it to whom, and what steps might be taken to stop the epidemic. We've actually seen the number of full-time equivalents, or FTEs, decrease for epidemiology rather than increase, and nearly half of them, of the epidemiology positions, are being filled in America by people who have never been formally trained in epidemiology. Not comforting. Well, all of this is coming at the same time as a nation and among our allies, our notion of what is national security is changing, or should change. It may not be changing as rapidly as it ought to. When the Bush administration came in 4 years ago, most people in the national security world, in the foreign policy world, were still thinking in Cold War terms, as if we were still dealing with us and the Soviet Union, and everybody else was just the stage on which our struggle played out. And in those kind of terms, you would define national security starts with the state itself, the nation, and its sovereignty, its economic integrity, its military capacity, embassies, and in terms of health, its sort of national health system, which in our case really heavily relied on our Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, its intelligence apparatus, and its police. And then you had your sort of regional organizations, pacts, treaties like NATO, and at the global level, you had détente, basically a minimal conflict, because the threat of mutually destructive thermonuclear war was so great that neither side dared blink. You had your World Bank. Nuclear détente, again, was the primary military issue, and it affected all aspects of diplomatic negotiations. The international health component had nothing to do with foreign policy. It was absolutely separated, and it was a kind of international altruism, if you will, heavily focused on use of vaccines. Today, if we were going to try to think about our globalized world in which more and more of the threats have nothing to do with national boundaries. It might look like this. You begin with the notion, are there even nations? Well, yes, there are some that believe they have sovereignties, but you also have pseudo-states like Chechnya, embedded inside of a nation that insists they are an independent state and wish to function so. And we see more and more and more of those. The hallmark of the end of the Cold War was the rising of pseudo-states. Yes, economic integrity is tightly linked now to the growth of your gross domestic product. A failure to have your GDP grow is a sign of a weakened state. Yes, you have your national military, you still have your embassies. You've seen some expansion in the notion of what at the nation level the health component of defense would be. It now includes non-governmental organizations and the media. The media is a player in conveying information about health threats. At the regional level, we've seen the emergence of the EU and other sort of federation forces around the world. We've seen a very big shift in regional competition with different parts of the world competing against each other over who has the cheapest labor pool for outsourcing from the wealthy states. You have the same basic regional forces playing out, such as NATO, and similar pacts, though now more and more you see non-governmental organizations playing a key role in international diplomacy. There are many places where Americans can no longer speak. Americans can no longer be players. We are totally hated. We are barred. We are despised. And more of American interests are being spoken for and carried out by non-governmental forces. We're beginning to see at the regional level the creation of regional surveillance laboratories for infectious diseases, regional surveillance, and the use of the internet to spread information about possible outbreaks. And regional intelligence services are beginning to arise, and huge regional police training programs. Globally, you know, when you ask what is a nation, you get to the global level and you ask, well, what is cyberspace? We see more and more corporations acting as if they really aren't part of any specific country, that their allegiance is to a pool of stockholders who may be spread out over 200 nations. We have less and less of a sense that the borders have much significance. And I think you're going to see in your lifetime a really dramatic change in the notion of what is the meeting of sovereignty and what is a national border, and what are completely entities that operate outside of any notion of sovereignty. Similarly, on the economic level, we're seeing international economic players and international economic accords taking primacy, such as the World Trade Organization, the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Accords, and the International Monetary Fund. We're seeing the use of national militaries under United Nations flag acting as peacekeeping forces now in more than 60 nations. And most importantly, it's the only thing that is the counterbalance to the fact that the U.S. is now the hegemonic state of the planet. Yeah. Not since ancient Rome has any nation held such a disproportionate level of the military force and capacity of the planet. If all the armies in the world united, they could not exceed the force capacity of the United States at this time. Embassies, we now also see a shift where more and more you see a media effect in diplomacy. I always think about the time I covered the Persian Gulf War in '91, and I knew the change was coming because I heard when I got back to Vienna from Iraq, I heard that OPEC was holding a secret meeting to reset oil prices. And I was hunting all over this hotel where OPEC was supposedly meeting, and I couldn't find them anywhere. And then it suddenly dawned on me, and I grabbed one of the valets at the hotel and slipped him $50 and said, "Where's the largest projector television screen?" And we got up to a bar that had been shut down as a bar, saw the guards, looked inside, and sure enough, there was OPEC watching CNN live coverage of the war. That tells you things have changed. And more, we're beginning to see a tremendous burden to create a global surveillance and response capacity for newly emerging infectious diseases, re-emerging infectious diseases, and bioweapons use. That capacity does not now exist, but the pressure is there to make it exist. And we're seeing evolving changes in the other parameters. There's another thing that's coming forward that we're beginning to recognize more and more, and that is that there's a cultural component to how a nation or a region sees national security. We tend to think, as Americans, that everybody would imagine the security of their nation and the prime issues that define the security of your nation the same way, but it's not true. I spent about a quarter of last year in China during the SARS epidemic, and that's when I realized that for much of Asia, particularly the People's Republic of China, national honor, or its counterpart, shame, is a component of national security, if not the #1 component of national security. Some folks would argue that our reaction to Abu Ghraib as a country showed that we do not feel that shame is part of our national security. For many of the very well-developed states, overseas trade and access to overseas markets is a component. When you get down into some of the poorest countries, the only real component they have of national security is economic growth, GDP growth. When you get into truly autocratic states, national security is simply the same thing as domestic stability. Keep the troublemakers down, throw the bad ones in prison, and exercise your control. And in many countries, it's about a kind of control of the resources of the country in the hands of a tiny elite. And in much of Europe, we now see a real culture war going on with France, Germany, Belgium, the Dutch, the Swedes, all signaling that their cultural integrity is part of national security. And maintaining that in the face of immigration is turning out to be quite a struggle. So when we look at that, we have to think, how does health, global health issues, fit in with these parameters? And surely, in the case of China, the biggest example of national shame they have experienced in many decades was the SARS epidemic, and that they were caught covering it up. When they were caught, the change was instantaneous. You know, the epidemic actually started on November 16th, 2002, in the southern province of Guangdong, which is just above Hong Kong, when a gentleman died of a previously unknown form of pneumonia. And then a small series of outbreaks occurred across, 5 of them, across that province over the next months. One of them, by January, erupted into a full-scale epidemic with more than 300 people hospitalized in 1 week with acute life-threatening pneumonia. All of this was covered up. All of it was lied about. Why? Because on the same day that the first case came forward, November 16th, the Party Congress, which is the elite of the Communist Party of China, decided to have the first ever bloodless transition of power, making a switch from the long-standing rule of Jiang Zemin as the leader of China to Hu Jintao as the leader of China, representing 2 different factions within the Communist Party, the Hu Jintao faction being the slightly more outwardly focused, it'd be going too far to say democratically focused, but liberalizing to some degree, compared to Jiang Zemin, who really came out of a military background and a very strict authoritarian focus by the party. So the party rule was nothing can rock the boat until March, when the official governing body meets to officially ratify the decision that the party has already made. So from November to March, you had to have a cover-up. It wasn't until April 20th, 2003, that the party finally admitted, and the government officially admitted to the world, what WHO had already been saying for some time, that they had an out-of-control SARS epidemic, and it was all over Beijing. And the next day, boom, Forbidden City, completely empty. Everywhere you turned, the streets were empty. The Great Wall, usually at this time of year, you'd have about 75,000 people packed on the Great Wall, 3 or 4 tourists. Tiananmen Square, other than the employees, hardly anybody there. Everywhere you went, people suddenly had on the masks, and there was a tremendous fear that they were dealing with a microbe that was just going to come flying right into their faces. Would like to note these masks would be utterly useless in such a case, as they were open on the sides. They're not form-fitting. They're open across the bridge of the nose, and they're made out of cotton, and they would take them home, wash them at night, and put them back on damp in the morning. I think they were probably a great deal more harmful than helpful. The economic impact was obvious and immediate all across China. Tens of thousands of foreign workers left the country, and almost all business meetings, everything came to a halt. You saw businesses like this nightclub trying to come up with creative ways to convince people it was safe to come inside. God knows how they could assure you there were no SARS in this nightclub. People thought if one mask would do, why not 2 or 3 or 4? And you actually had people with cardiac conditions having breathing problems because they were wearing too many masks. There's a very busy chart, and I won't try to go through the whole thing. It's only to point out that what played out in China was that they had this faction dispute between the old Jiang Zemin faction and the Hu Jintao faction inside not just the party, but the entire government apparatus. And the two factions were deciding how to tackle SARS completely different ways. So that every day, if you were a local health worker, you got completely opposing sets of instructions. You know, for example, down in Guangdong, the Minister of Health knew there was some kind of an outbreak going on down there. He went down and tried to order them to give him samples and information, but the party boss in Guangdong actually outranked the Minister of Health, even though the Minister of Health was in the cabinet, because the party is more powerful than the government. And he said, get out of here. Go away. I'm not talking to you. You're not getting any samples out of us. End of story. And he was a Jiang Zemin loyalist. The cover-ups continued, but the good news is eventually the Hu Jintao faction started to win out. And you saw them embrace a harm reduction model for treating HIV or preventing HIV. You saw the Vice Premier, Wen Jiabao, publicly embrace an AIDS patient for the first time. And on the other hand, the old Jiang Zemin faction remained in power, and they ordered the house arrests of 2 leading AIDS activists, one of whom, Jiang, remains under arrest today. Hu Jia was released but is under constant police surveillance. So it still is a difficult place, a dicey place to try and do work related to global health issues. I was personally under surveillance all the time there, but we're seeing a change, and we're seeing a change because of SARS. Still, they did it all wrong, and I can't tell you whether they do it all wrong again. Besides the cover-up, once they went public, and you have to try to imagine this, if you were all students at Beijing University, here's what happened to the students, these kids you see here. The word gets out on April 20th in an official announcement. Now, you've been hearing rumors for days of a strange new disease, all kinds of rumors, and they've been mostly spread with SMS text messaging on your cell phones, which people are fanatic about over there. So every time you turn your phone on, there's another alert, and it's saying, you know, the rumor is lots of people dying at Ditan Hospital 6. And you don't know what to make, but it's making you nervous. April 20th, the government finally admits we've been lying. Okay, now, as a student, you're part of the elite. You actually are educated, you can read, you can write, you're developing advanced skills. So you have power of reason and skepticism, and you know the government's lied, so now you're not going to believe anything the government says. From now on, it's all a pack of lies. So then the word goes out on SMS text messaging. The government's going to round up all the students and use the epidemic as an excuse to repress us. Escape the city now. April 21st, thousands and thousands and thousands of students went to the train stations and with their masks on and fled to their home provinces all over the massive country of China. Many of them unknowingly were carrying SARS and took it out to the provincial level. The same thing was spread to the immigrant workers. When I say immigrant, they're all Chinese, but they come from the provincial level into the cities where they work as blue-collar workers, and they're internally called migrant workers. Thousands of them also fled as the rumors spread that the whole epidemic was an excuse for a massive repression of the masses. The government lacked the classic public health skills that would have made it possible to bring this thing under control in a more civil manner. They didn't have epidemiologists trained who knew how to identify the source of outbreaks. And indeed, even as late as a year later, they were saying they didn't know where more than 70% of the people who got SARS caught it. How did they catch it? Who'd they get it from? They don't have the capacity to do what's called contact tracing. And finding, you know, if you carry SARS, and I've proven it, finding everybody you've been sitting next to recently, eaten meals with, shared dorm room with, and so on, and bringing them in for testing. That's how we would do it here. They could not. So what did they have to do? They had to operate on the assumption that the entire country of 1.3 billion people had SARS and needed to be controlled. They immediately set up quarantine posts like this one. Any building that was thought to have had more than 2 SARS cases in it was placed under total house arrest by the police. Nobody in or out, food slipped under the door. The entire hospitals were placed under house arrest. No one was allowed to leave the hospital facilities. The healthcare workers had to live there for 3 months, never seeing their own families. If you happened to be in the hospital for some other reason, you didn't get out again until they declared that SARS was all gone, no matter what reason it was that you went to the hospital in the first place. Everywhere they set up, at every travel debarkation point, every train station, bus station, airport, you name it, they set up posts where a military personnel and a health personnel side by side interrogated everybody and took their temperatures. If you were found to have a fever, that's it, no questions asked, off you go to a quarantine center, no matter why you had a fever. Out at the village level, the people didn't believe any of this was going to work, and they were terrified that SARS would come to their villages because they don't have any state-subsidized health care. So if you're a peasant and you end up in the hospital, one night's hospitalization is the equivalent of a year's income. So they set up their own quarantines, barred all entry to the villages. And you suddenly saw the flow of agricultural goods grind to a halt as more and more basic food goods disappeared off the shelves of the big cities. Out on the highways, I was pulled over about every 12 miles and had to undergo another fever check. It made getting anywhere a long trip. But you also worried, you know, what if I just am hot and I show a fever, you know? What happens to me? Where do I go? And the answer is, you go off to a military-run quarantine center, and they confiscate your cell phones, and there's no way for you to contact your loved ones, and that's it. And you just hope it all eventually is over with and you don't die of SARS. Well, that, you know, has opened a lot of eyes, SARS. Not just China's eyes and Hong Kong's eyes and the eyes of Toronto and the other afflicted areas, but eyes in Washington and corporate eyes. More and more businesses that are globalized started thinking about SARS and thinking, well, aren't we lucky that one was only 15% lethal? But what if we had something much worse, something more lethal, such as something that came out of this city, believe it or not, called a city, looks like this. It's chickweed. Chickweed in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, formerly Zaire. 450,000 people live here, and they call it a city, though this is what it looks like. What if that Ebola had managed to globalize that emerged in 1995? Well, one of the trends that we see in the world right now is the most radical movement of humanity from rural to urban areas ever witnessed in the history of Earth. Overnight, entire countries are turning from being majority rural to majority urban. And perhaps more importantly is the emergence of these mega cities, defined as a city with 10 million or more people in it. There used to be just 2 megacities, New York and London's actually shrunk and come off the megacity list. But what we see now are megacities emerging that have no infrastructure and no money. Buenos Aires, Cairo, Istanbul, Tianjin, Hyderabad, Bangkok, Manila, Jakarta. These are places where there is no money and no political will to make a megacity that is a safe place to live, that has appropriate sewer systems, water systems, housing, and all the infrastructure of public health in place. But they do have international airports. And actually, the trend is even more dramatic because we're seeing instant cities appearing, especially all over Africa and Southeast Asia, where there had been only villages less than a generation ago. And often, there's no rational reason why everybody has moved to a given place. I mean, again, this is in Congo, this city I was in. There's no industry, there's no media, there's no telephones, there's no electricity, but there's 400,000+ people. And you have no health services, you have no infrastructure of any kind. We're also seeing the movement of humanity from one urban area to another for economic reasons, hoping and praying they're going to find a better life. Like this family I met who lived under the Hooghly Bridge in Calcutta. They'd fled Bangladesh, come to Calcutta with all their worldly goods, and now weeks later here they are with no toilet facilities, no money, living homeless under a bridge. We see more and more of this throughout the developing world today. These instant slums get created, where humanity moves in, never imagining they're going to be living like this for years on end. It was in this neighborhood in Surat, India, that pneumonic plague emerged in 1994. And during the epidemic, when I was there, all the rich fled the city. And it was in these slums that the plague kept spreading because nobody stayed behind to care for them. The hospitals closed down, and they had no money and no capacity to understand what was happening. You could say to them, it's only a bacterial disease. Well, what's a bacteria? Well, you could take an antibiotic. What's an antibiotic? You're dealing with semi-literate populations with no real understanding of the germ theory of disease. And so everywhere around the world, we see these slapdash pseudo-housing situations appearing in which people live side by side with the animals that they've brought from the rural areas. Densely populated, creating fantastic opportunities for what are called zoonotic diseases, which SARS was a zoonotic disease, something that originated in an animal and jumped to human beings with fantastic consequences. We're also seeing that all of this movement of humanity is putting tremendous pressure on water supplies. I mean, you're in a drought here and you're thinking water supplies means do you have water? But I'm talking about the inappropriate use of water. Again, this is downtown Calcutta, and you have from a single water source, girls washing their hands, a pig urinating, some girls washing dishes, pigs defecating, and a woman defecating upstream, all in a single source of water. So you're obviously talking about disease heaven, microbe stew. And something that most people don't think about, doesn't instantly come to their minds when they think about public health, is drainage systems. But another hallmark of these instant cities cropping up all over the world are the lack of drainage, so that you have open water standing all over the place. And what happens when you have standing open water in a tropical environment? Mosquitoes. And so now we have urbanized malaria, urbanized dengue fever, urbanized mosquito-borne viral diseases. And all of this is less and less remote every day. We're globalizing everything at a fantastic pace. And what might have been considered a remote area yesterday is today an area for exotic travel by adventurous college students, and tomorrow an area for an outsourced software factory. Increasingly, we're asking questions about airborne risks in airplane travel, and though many of the airplanes have tried to put new systems in to clean the air, we did have SARS transmission on 5 jets last year. This is coming at a background of an ever-increasing rate of tuberculosis. According to the World Health Organization, this is their chart, their projections. An ever-increasing percentage of the TB in the world is drug-resistant, worse yet, multi-drug resistant. The key thing to keep in mind about tuberculosis is that it is, in order to really cleanse the mycobacterium from your body, you have to take 4, sometimes 5 antibiotics together for 18 months. There are only about 10 antibiotics that are really effective against tuberculosis. So if you have drug resistance if you have a strain that's resistant against 4 or 5, you can see that you're very quickly running out of your options for effective treatment. And indeed, all over the world now, we're encountering people like this man I met in Moscow who are victims of completely drug-resistant tuberculosis, incurable super TB. He doesn't know how he got it, but this is how they had to treat him. They surgically removed one lung, punched a tracheotomy through which he could breathe because he had to lose some of his lung muscles, and part of another lung was removed. And this is called TB treatment. We've not had to resort to such radical surgical approaches to tuberculosis in the United States in well over 50 years. But if the trends in drug resistance continue, we're going to have to be thinking these things through for us. This is all coming against a background of an increasing gap in life expectancy. The longest lived society is Japan, and the shortest lived societies are in West Africa and Zimbabwe. The gap between them is statistically now almost 50 years. Now, I know that you might think, well, there's always been poor countries and there's always been richer countries. That's true. But we have never before, as a human race, faced a gap like this. We've never before had a situation where some societies, such as our own, could, on a statistical basis, imagine knowing their great-grandchildren, while other societies, on a statistical basis, could not imagine seeing their own children grow up. The shortest life expectancies now on Earth, such as Zimbabwe, are down at around 27 years. So some of you have already outlived Zimbabwean statistical probability of life expectancy. And one of the key reasons is our friend HIV. The AIDS virus, of course, as you all know, has spread all over the world, but is still heavily concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa. The fastest growing epidemic right now is in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, but the greatest burden is in sub-Saharan Africa, and increasingly the sub-Saharan African epidemic is feminizing. Right now, it's about 60% of new cases are female, 40% male. If the trend continues, we're going to be looking at an overwhelming majority female disease. It's also a disease of children, and people often forget this. It's a combination of mother-to-child transmission, so that the babies are born infected, and an increasing trend of sort of predatory sexuality, where older men are looking for very young virgin girls because they believe that having sex with a virgin takes their HIV away. And so you have more and more girls age 12 and 13 contracting HIV, and that is why the epidemic is becoming more and more female. Well, if you look at the international trend with HIV, you could see that mortality or death is just steadily rising, and we've never seen an epidemic like this of anything, except if you were to take the first 18 months of the Black Death in Europe and take your time scale down to 18 months, it would look like this. Otherwise, most epidemics, your slope would be sort of like that. The classic, what's known as bell-shaped curve. HIV shows no sign of dipping, and we've really not found naturally immune people. So this is something new to our species. We don't have immunity to this virus, and we don't create effective immunity. We make antibodies like crazy. Our immune system puts up a huge battle, but it doesn't win. Over time, it is defeated. Now, the interesting thing is if you look at this bottom green line, this is the United States HIV epidemic, and you see we've been rising in mortality, and then here comes 1996, and boom, it starts heading down to zero. What happened in 1996 was the introduction of highly active antiretroviral therapy, the combination drug treatments that are saving lives. Now, these are not ideal drugs. We don't know what it's going to mean to take them for 10 years, for 20 years. They have side effects. They're less than perfect, that is for sure. But they're keeping people alive. The important thing is it's had no statistical impact on the overall mortality due to HIV in the world, because these drugs are not available to these people. They can't afford them. And so that takes us to a fundamental spiritual, ethical, moral crisis as a planet. Are we going to just continue to watch as the coffins pile up and the graveyards fill? We know we have the drugs to save them, but we're not getting the drugs to them because of economic barriers. Is this a tolerable world for us to live in? It's, you know, the expression, am I my brother's keeper? I think we are. I think that we've globalized everything else. We must also globalize the burden. But the death toll to counter it is going to be a tough nut, a really tough nut to crack. First of all, the overall prevalence is astronomical in certain parts of Africa. I mean, South Africa, these are the rates of infection in young women when they show up to have a baby. And they're tested for HIV infection. And just look at these, you know, roughly a third of them HIV positive already. And in fact, the South African epidemic is very new. HIV didn't get into South Africa until after the end of apartheid in any significant level. So this is a brand spanking new epidemic, and it's already up to about 30% infection rates. This epidemic has played a role in bringing down those life expectancies and widening that life expectancy gap I was talking about. And when you look at some of these, just look at the graphic and just see where it's going. I mean, what we're talking about is you go through this period here. This is when the whole world was investing in the development of these poor countries. When we had the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, all the Christian organizations, all sorts of direct U.S. bilateral aid pouring in to try and build schools and build an infrastructure in these countries. And along comes HIV, and all the benefit of that development is being erased in just a few years. This is the most important graphic I'm going to show you. So if you're thinking what will be on the test, this I want you to completely understand. And if after I explain it, any of you don't understand this, put your hand in the air, because I want to make sure everybody walks out of this room completely understanding what's in this slide. This happens to be a projection for Botswana, but I have these for every country in sub-Saharan Africa, for all of the former Soviet countries, and for many of the South Asia countries. And so you could see the similar effects. They just vary a little based on the numbers in their given country. What you're looking at is a projection, this one going out to the year 2020, of what the distribution by age of the society will look like. Now the center line is your 0 point. To the right is the number of people, females, and to the left, the number of males. And up here you have their age group. So if you follow across from, say, age 25, you could see that there's going to be a fair chunk of senior citizens, as you see in all societies, who will be dependent on their middle-aged children to take care of them. They're retired and they count on their families to take care of them. And then you're going to have all these kids, and you have this classic sort of bulge pear shape to the society demographically. However, that is what would happen in the absence of AIDS. The red is the absence of AIDS. In the pink is what AIDS is doing to distort the distribution of society. And this is what's known as the chimney effect. You still see this senior citizen dependent population, but the entire middle-aged population is gone. They've died. So here's your not only the adults who would take care of their elderly parents and raise their children, but here are your cops, dead. Your politicians, dead. Your leadership, your lawyers, your doctors, your civil service. In other words, your entire productive labor force and your entire professional elite that would run your society. Meanwhile, you have this huge bulge of post-adolescents, young people, kids your age and younger, and what do they do in the absence of parental supervision? The very things that put them at risk for HIV infection. Now, when economists look at a slide like this, they see complete economic collapse. They say, that's the end of the economy of this society. You can't run anything. You can't make any business, and you certainly, as a foreigner, would not invest in that country, in that demographic. Where's your labor force? When national security people look at this, they see something even worse. They see civil war. They see the rise of despots and religious zealots. They see support for fertile ground for recruiting would-be terrorists. They see millions of orphans run amok brought in by Fagin-like characters into criminal groups, and they see lawlessness. Wait, I have to ask. Anybody not understand that? Okay. Now, we don't have to just talk about projecting out to 2020. We can say it's right here, right now. And I know our time is coming short here, and many of you have to rush off to classes, so let me just really quickly wrap this up. I've been in villages where the chimney effect is already in effect. It's already real. This, for example, is Chebe, Uganda. This 81-year-old woman took me on a tour of her small plot of land where, as her sole source of income, she grows bananas. And throughout it, she had these mounds of stones under which she had buried her husband, 10 out of 12 of her children, and 10 out of 33 of her grandchildren, every one of them dead to HIV. And with nothing but bananas to sell, she was single-handedly raising 23 grandchildren. In this part of Africa, in the Great Lakes region where it started, people call it grandmother's disease. Now, the grandmothers are dying. They're in their 80s. They can't handle the burden. So what happens? Well, for the first time in the history of Africa, we have orphanages. This wasn't a tradition in Africa. Traditionally in Africa, an orphan child was absorbed by the clan, and the village cared for the child. But the villages are now so overwhelmed they can't do it. So now we have, such as this one in Bukoba, Tanzania, these little instant orphanages that exclusively take babies whose parents have died of AIDS and raise them until they're 2 years old, and then turn them over to a little girl who comes from the same clan, may not be a relative, but comes from the same clan. And 9 and 10-year-old girls are raising 2, 3, and 4 babies. These little girls are remarkable in that they can actually find food, they can clean each other, clean the kids. They're really resourceful, but they are illiterate. They don't know their family history. They're orphans too. And they can't tell these kids who their ancestors were, what the history of their people is, why the Shona people do such and such on December 13th, and why the Ndebele do this and that ritual on January 4th. And so in short, we're already watching entire cultures die. This is a devastation that is absolutely astronomical. And if you want to see and imagine how bad it could get, you go to Concencero, where this all started. This isn't the first place a human being ever got HIV, but this is where this modern epidemic took off. It's located on the border of Uganda and Tanzania on Lake Victoria. They are in their 4th generation of this epidemic. They started having mass die-offs in the early 1970s, and it is a place of orphans. Orphans against orphans. Lawless, no values. Food is put out in giant kettles on the street, and the little children all dive at it and beat each other up for a meal 3 times a day. Is this the future of Africa? Could this be what we're going to witness? I think we're witnessing in slow motion the Black Death of the 14th century. In Florence, 80% of the population died in 18 months in 1348. This is the most poignant. Giovanni Villani was a very, very revered historian of the 14th century. He literally was writing a description of the plague and died mid-sentence. In the midst of the pestilence, there came to an end. Boccaccio writes of the plague in Florence and tells us, one man shunned another, kinsfolk held aloof, brother was forsaken by brother, oftentimes husband by wife. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children to their fate, untended, unvisited, as if they had been strangers. We saw them decide to burn the Jews because the Jews must have brought the plague. And all over Africa today, all over Southeast Asia, even here in America, you hear the most bizarre explanations about this pandemic. You have people in this country who insist HIV is harmless. You have people in South Africa, the president of South Africa, who insists there's no pandemic, there's just economic chaos. And you have people blaming everything from the CIA to another religious group for creating the plague. It's just the modern day version of burning the Jews. If we imagine what the plague did to reshape Europe, and now project ahead to how it is reshaping Africa and soon to reshape other parts of the world, especially Russia and Ukraine, Think about it, something around 24 million people died in a year and a half in Europe. We had entire populations obliterated in certain parts of Europe. And the result was that the labor force was gone. So agricultural labor collapsed. Well, guess what? We now have 2 ongoing famines in southern Africa, directly because there's no labor force to do the farming anymore. We had a loss of faith in the Catholic Church, and it undermined the tremendous control that the Catholic Church had over all of Europe because they were unable to explain the plague or pray it away. And indeed, in many cases, the priests were so terrified they refused to do final last rites for the dying. In the end, the only way to maintain the control of the church was that Pope Clement actually sold the right to become priests and added to it as a bonus that you could sell indulgences so that priests could be profit centers by helping you buy your sins away. All of that led to an erosion of feudalism, a disruption of the powers, and eventually ushered in the Renaissance and the Reformation. And just to finally close this, the CIA report of 2002 projects that HIV is now going into 5 very strategic countries, very important, large countries, Nigeria, Ethiopia, China, Russia, and India. In 2002, they thought combined, those countries had at most 23 million people living with HIV, and that within 6 years from now, it would be up perhaps as high as 75 million with this sort of prevalence breakdown. Russia does not dispute these numbers, nor do Ethiopia and Nigeria, but India and China remain in denial. And actually right now, India is in a worse case of denial, absolutely insistent that the whole world is overstating their HIV/AIDS problem. But I've seen it firsthand on the ground, and it's every bit as ominous as what I saw 15 years ago in Africa. And Russia, it's reached so bad that they can't even find military recruits that can pass the physical. In fact, about 50% of all would-be recruits failed their entry physicals in Russia this year. There are 3 major reasons: drug abuse, tuberculosis, and HIV.